Welcome back to the Elevate Your Best podcast. My name is Michael Danklefs.
And I am Bruno Martins. And today we are going to talk about the emotional area of our lives.
So as we unfold for this year, as we started off in January talking about health and fitness, and then in February was our intellectual life. As we move into March, then we're looking at our emotional life and how it impacts us, and really discovering and talking and getting to the crux for at least us, how that impacts our lives. So the first question we really had here is, why do emotions move us? What does that trigger? Why is that where we get pulled or pushed around in our life? And I know so many people that get triggered because something happens outside of their life. And I certainly have had that experience on many different occasions myself. And there's this idea of moving from an unawareness of the emotions as they're coming up and taking action based on them, versus bringing this intentionality to the emotions that we want in our life, and really getting familiar with, in some practices, they refer to it more as your emotional body, that we have our physical body, an emotional body, a mental body, and a spiritual body. So that's, if we talk about that as more of a body of work or an aspect of who we are, is it really, to me, is talking about kind of the indicator lights on a dashboard of where we are, where our thoughts are in connection to our spirit. So the things we're going to be discussing today is really going to start with why emotions move us, but then also maybe potentially dealing with some of our stereotypes around emotions, and really digging into a little bit about the emotional body, and then how meaning matters. Because I know at least one or two people that talk about that the human being is a meaning-making machine. I believe it was actually Devin Bailey, who was on the Elevation Mindset Summit, who talks about that the human being is a meaning-making machine. So the experiences that we have will trigger emotions in us, but it's generally not the action itself that has a bad or a good connotation. It's the meaning we apply to it. So that's really what we're going to be wrapping up with today. So first off, I really want to talk about this idea of stereotypes. So
Before you go there, Michael, one thing that I find interesting, Michael, in what you just said, is that it's an idea that we scratched on for, how the four bodies that you mentioned are like the physical body, the emotional body, the mental body, and the spiritual body. They are the four first categories of the Lifebook Process. And you mentioned that the first five are focused on the self along with character, right? So it's first we get our bodies together. We can make this analogy. We really construct ourselves. And we might see this in a deeper level than we did before, because we mentioned that this is a construction of the self, the first five categories. And then we move to start to cover bigger layers of our reality than ourselves. That's very interesting.
thank you for pointing that out. So when I've been working with my clients, working through the Lifebook process, many times I share with them that, at least for me, that the emotional category was a tough one. And really discovering that for me, that falls into that category of stereotype. Because in many cultures on our planet, emotions are hard for men, that it's a hard category, that it's difficult to actually work through emotions. And I think a lot of that has to do with conditioning. It has a lot to do with our upbringing, our culture, and what we've actually applied value to. And I would say that many times stereotypes tend to come from a large percentage of ways that people act, but it doesn't mean that it's a universal truth. Because one of the other ones that I know, at least here in the United States, that we talk about is that women are too emotional as a stereotype. And I would say that each of the genders, or even anywhere in between, we each have our own relationship, if you will, with our emotions. There are some people who very well can navigate through their emotions, man or woman, and some who have a lot of difficulty. And many times whenever our emotions are not manageable for us, this in turn becomes some sort of mental illness or some other challenge that we have with our life. But I know that Bruno and I, when we were preparing for this, it's my belief that women navigate their emotions easier. It's not impossible for men to do. It's not impossible for men to express their emotions even. But the question is, how skilled are we at it? Even at one point, I took an anger management course. And a lot about what they talked about wasn't that it's not so much that you squash and remove anger from your life. The big goal that I learned from that was separate the timing from whenever you feel the emotion to when you act on it. Because in that time, the level of response to something may change. So our emotions really are, though, that guidance system for how our thoughts relate to where we really want to go, where our spirit, our soul is actually connecting. That's my belief. And I think that men have been given a hard time because it can be more challenging for us.
I don't quite remember very well the situation, Michael, but there was a time when you mentioned something and you say it would be hard to express that through anger, with anger, using anger. So it's an emotion, it's a tool, like it's translated. Perhaps you use the word translate that. When we are feeling the emotion, we are gonna put something out there, and that emotion will set the tone, temper the things, like you say, wait a little bit, allow the emotion to dissipate a little bit. So when we put out something, it might be better flavored for the others that will receive it. Yeah, that's very interesting. And what I thought as well when you were speaking was that stereotypes are also educational. It's like stereotypes teach. If we say culturally, doesn't necessarily mean that thing was manifested into culture for it to become a stereotype. It might have just be someone that planted an idea and that idea was accepted. And because that idea was accepted, it was repeated so much. And then people that grew in that culture, they learned. So a man might learn to express things through anger and only express things through anger and fear or something like that. Or maybe not fear, but like something like that. But then the society, the culture, educate women to talk more, to have better relationships, to get together in groups that, like, men don't go together to the bathroom, women do, you know? So they have bonds that are teach by culture that we do not learn, that allow them, as you say, to develop their skills in communicating their emotions. Because it's a communication. When we feel something, we require an internal communication to understand what we are feeling. Like, how do we translate that? And then there is another level of communication, which is to communicate what we are feeling to others. And we might not understand what we are feeling, not know that we are actually communicating what we are feeling to others, but the way we are expressing is communicating something. So it's a matter of communication.
And I think that's a great place to come at this from. Is I know that there's a fair amount of people who discuss kind of how we've evolved into what our emotions are for and how they've been evolved over time. If we're looking at the general caveman version of this, it's men go out and hunt and women stay back and actually collect, and they harvest instead. And they also manage relationships better, where because men tended to be more physical in their strengths, literally and figuratively, that they would go out and hunt, where there wasn't much communication. In fact, you had to be very quiet most of the time so that you could catch your game, so that you ate. So in many ways, there's a different form of communication. It's much more of you trust the person next to you without having to vet them many times, because generally the ones who are good at what they did stuck around. The ones who were not good at what they did got eaten.
That was a very simple means of selection.
Absolutely. It literally is a natural selection at that point. And unfortunately, as much as technology has evolved as much as it has, our emotional system has not necessarily evolved quite as quickly, has not actually shifted and changed. And except for just in the past, what, 60 years or so, that we've got a lot more acceptance of people who are not polarly one gender or another. That we actually have a lot more mix of what attributes mean masculine versus feminine, what means man versus woman. There's a lot more discussion, a lot more acceptance lately around that. And to the point now that something that used to be a standard calling a man out for being overly emotional is actually considered a slur at this point. So society certainly is looking to equalize that to some degree. I don't think it necessarily makes it any easier for us as we do have these emotions coming up. At least I know it hasn't for me. I do consider myself straight or cis, depending on which community you're in. And I'm okay with that. And I'm also open to anyone who's going to present whatever identity or preference that they have. If you do you, I'll do me. But I also know that rubs people wrong in so many other different communities.
You are actually, Michael, and this is a trigger for people in the gender fluid community because I don't know, somehow ignorance, yeah, of course, they are hurt by ignorance. So when people don't know something, they get triggered. I don't think this is the approach. I think that when people don't know something, we get and explain. And here is the thing. You are actually both, Michael. You are both heterosexual and you are cisgender because one thing has nothing to do with another. Heterosexual means that it is your sexual orientation is towards the opposite sex. And cisgender means that you are a biological man that identify with the figure, the archetypes of men, like the male archetype. Like you are born a man and you identify with the male sex. So you are actually both. Yeah.
Awesome.
Some
Just to
people
complicate
that I
things a little bit
know,
more.
some people that I know would be very upset for this small confusion. But I do believe that the community needs to understand that people from outside of the community just doesn't have the vocabulary. It's not that they aim to provoke, it's just that there's no, the definitions are not there yet. Things are new. Like you say, to complicate a little bit more.
And I'm certainly for me, I'm open to feedback of how I'm being received. Is thank you for that and that clarification, because it certainly is something I'm less exposed to, and not completely, isolated for sure, but it's I like that idea of instead of getting upset because somebody is ignorant of the idea, is it's an opportunity to educate until it becomes this place where it's actually used as a lever against you, when it's used as a way to make you not just different but lesser. And I think that too many people use ignorance as the reason why they've actually put themselves above someone else. And
And you, sorry, finish because there is something very interesting with what we just spoke about related to this.
so it's just this idea of me personally, it's you do you, I'll do me, and I'm okay with you being on your journey and I'll be on mine. And there's gonna be lessons I'm gonna learn, there's gonna be lessons that you're gonna learn, and there might be an overlap for us to actually learn similar lessons depending on how we come together.
Yeah. And I think it's important to recognize this difference in the journeys because sometimes people meet us in their journey and they have their values, their causes, and everything, their experiences. And we are focused on something else. And or we have our experiences and that other person is focused on something else. And then we're like, how can you ignore my journey? Accept that when we meet people, they might help us, they might not, because they are in their own journey, they have their own purpose. And the thing is about what you said, Michael, is that what I have experienced, not only with that, but with other minority groups, we do have a lot of problem with racism here and social segregation. And here's the thing, is that it relates with the expressing things through anger. It's not just men that don't culturally know how to very well express their emotions. It's actually something that it might be more prominent with men thanks to the culture, but we don't have the culture anywhere in this spectrum, male or female or the genders. We don't have the culture of dealing with our emotion, understanding our emotional body. We are going to talk about that. And then people come and they express things. How are the strongest emotions? And this is a strong subject. This is something that's deeply related with the identity of the person. So that person will be very emotional about that. So how so much emotion comes with little things that these people might be hurt about, and then they translate through anger. Small mistakes. It's what we are talking about. Like we just need to broaden. It's not so much about the stereotypes. There are stereotypes, but everybody culturally has this hard time grasping what their emotion really means. And we tend to, particularly when we are defending things that we are passionate about, express things either with great joy or great anger.
And both really come down to passion. And you could have that high level of love or that high level of hatred. And each of them are passionate about what we are. We tend to be really passionate about things that we consider our identity, or when things challenge our beliefs. And I think that it's a matter of bringing some compassion to that situation for someone who, and once again, I know that I'm in that, here in the United States, at least, in a privileged class, over 40, male, white. So it may feel odd coming from me about asking for compassion. And it's something that I'm in turn, for me as a core value, it's something I'm going to express and request from other people. But who am I to ask someone who's had a stereotype used against them over and over again to be compassionate to others when they've experienced that their whole life? I know that's a challenge, because a slur, a put down, a made less than for whatever aspect of who you are, has an emotional charge to it. It's when we talked about the 4 agreements several months ago at this point. It's that agreement about yourself. It's the emotional wounds that we take on because we are treated in a particular way over a period of time. Or even that one person who you trusted and cared about, who used their words as a weapon against you. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's as much about educating ourselves as it is if you see ignorance, instead of holding that ignorance against that person. Actually, there was a post I saw on LinkedIn several weeks ago that kind of is what brings this up for me. It was a woman who was upset because, why is it my job to educate you about what my experience is? And once again, I it's hard for me to go there. I want to be the ally, I want to be the advocate. But if I don't know what I don't know, how can I be supportive? How can I be in a place where I can provide benefit and value? And to me, that it's that place of I'm aiming for curiosity. I'm aiming for humility, not aiming from because I know better. And that's, I think, where we need to balance all of that. Is tell me about you. Tell me what your struggle is. Tell me where your challenge. Tell me about your wins. Tell me about your successes. Let's celebrate those successes, regardless of where you came from, regardless of what color, what religion, what gender, what preference, whatever. Who are you? Educate me on that. It's even one of the things identity-wise, and this is one of those emotional things for me, is my name is Michael. When somebody asks me what my name is, I tell them my name is Michael. And I can't tell you the number of people who turn around and say, "Hi, Mike, nice to meet you." That's not my name. That's a name you've given me. And how dare you have the audacity to give me a nickname when you just met me? It's the same thing if I were to call someone jerk or asshole, I'm giving you a nickname. That's something that has been an emotional trigger for me for quite a while. Is if someone introduces me to me and gives me their name, I want to learn their name and learn who they are, because that's a piece of their identity and not make something up.
Yeah. And it's all about what you said before, Michael, what we identify with. Like when you spoke about people being triggered as well, it's hard when it's about this identification. It's, let's say that someone that deeply hurt that person has that same lack of knowledge. He doesn't have that information. So that's a trait that the person captures. Like, oh, so people that hurt me don't know this difference. So when they see this difference, they don't care. They might not. Remember unconscious decisions. As we say before, we see signs and we make small unconscious decisions that lead us into an action. So then the person say, hey, I see that trigger. How do I react to that trigger? And then a person classifies you, identifies you with a group and how they engage with that group, and then comes a whole lot of baggage. Yeah. And about the name as well, I also think it's important to remember the person by their proper name. I never thought about this idea of the nickname, Michael. Get to know someone and then say, abbreviate the name of the person and be like, yeah, I they never thought about that. But I actually ask people, how do people call you sometimes? When I see the person, Natalia, for example, common name here, and then someone calls Nathi and then other Nat, and then there's a whole variation. I'm like, how do you like to be called? I ask this to the person. And then the person says, oh, everybody calls me that. And I'm like, but how do you like to be called? And when people have detrimental nicknames, I have a few, it's acquaintances, the word, like people that I don't wish to use friends, people that I know, but not actually people that I hang out with. They are acquaintances, people that I know. And they have these very detrimental nicknames. One of the guys called Matuto. Everybody calls him Matuto. And Matuto means it's like someone from the far.
Redneck would be the term here in the
Sorry?
United States. A redneck.
Redneck.
Yes.
Yes.
Someone who's
So people,
uneducated potentially, and the only thing they're good for is menial labor.
okay, the redneck nickname, as I associate with different things because of culture. You have guys have a different history, but yeah, very similar. Someone that is only good for manual labor, comes from the interior, looking for opportunity to work with anything, don't know how to express themselves. And then I'm like, I'm not gonna call this like that. And then, what's your name? And he's like, it's Matuto. I'm like, no, girl, your name. What's your name? And then everybody calls this guy Matuto, and I call him Anderson because his name is Anderson. And people don't identify when I'm talking, oh, Anderson. They're like, who? And I have to say Matuto.
It's this, to me, like I said, a nickname is something that there generally is some emotion behind it, even that there's an experience you had with that person and it connects you to that person because you've had an experience. That to me is what a nickname is about. As an example, I was on a soccer team as a kid and we had 7 Michaels on the soccer team. So everyone got a nickname because you can't just say Michael. And for me, they couldn't pronounce my last name, so they called me Bigfoot. I was the tallest kid on the field in the team, and I had the biggest feet, so it made sense. But there wasn't generally a detrimental aspect of that. But to me, once again, it connects you with that emotional experience. So that was a nickname that I had, and I still remember it to this day, almost 40 years later, because it actually had that impact. But if you're going to pick, if there's going to be a nickname, know me first, because it, to me, it's similar to inauthentic marketing. To me, is don't express to me as if you know me until you get to know me. And that's what I'm talking about here, is around the stereotyping of this. Is I don't personally, I don't care what color your skin is. I don't care what religion you come from. How do you act? How do you show up? If you're going to walk like a gangster and talk like a gangster, you're going to be treated like a gangster. If you're going to act like someone who actually has respect for others, I believe that you will get respected in return. That's how I want to be treated. And therefore, that's how I want to treat others. If you're going to...
Therefore, cultural impacts might cause consequences. For example, if you are a very respectful and polite person, you might get into a community of people that do not understand that language, and they will hostilize. They'll see a spray or something like that. If depending on where you are,
which I get, and because it's something different, it can be seen as weakness.
it's a communication. We need to understand who we are communicating with. If we are communicating with the people of our same culture, I believe that everything's fine. Just a last thing, Michael, because those people like that might, like for example, I'm visualizing you, the people that might find your politeness and education threatening or predatory, they have their politeness and their education and their way of communicating respect. So people will say something, and what you say will be applicable, like, oh yeah, they respect each other. If you show respect, you will show respect. But depending on the culture, displaying respect might be different. That's what I meant to say.
Gotcha. And it's very much, I believe that I've heard the term of code switching, of using the words and the presentation depending on the environment that you're in. And I would say that most of us on the planet do that to some degree. Is if I'm talking to my daughter, it's going to be different than if I'm talking to somebody for work. It's going to be a different experience. And until we actually get familiar enough that we can actually joke around and potentially skirt that edge of professionality, but because there's then a deeper connection between two people. So it's that cultural norm thing is one of the things that it frustrates me, and I get it at the same time. Is I have traveled across most of the United States, and I've been outside of the United States in a couple of different countries as well. And the ways that emotions are expressed is very different in very different cultures. And I am ignorant of a lot of them, and I'm willing to own that. How do I then educate myself? It's by showing up with curiosity and compassion and interest too. That's what I would ask of others is, instead of coming at this, I know who you are because you look like this. Instead, come from a place of curiosity of, hey, what's your story? How can I help? So it's a rugged place to be.
And I think that this whole thing of this identity, what we identify with, these nicknames, as we spoke, we could visualize, I could visualize, I hope you could visualize as well, that those are kind of pieces that we put together from our history, from our past, from our experiences. Those are experiences that we put together. And that's why we call the culmination of the experiences we have, the emotional experiences we have, our emotional body. Because it has the capacity to be hurt. It has the capacity to feel strong, like we might be very firm psychological. People talk about people that have willpower, strong willpower. Like probably the emotional body might be very strong or something like that. I don't know exactly how to express, but we have this spiritual body that we create, and it's a great part of us, and we need to take care of it. And sometimes in our culture, we don't have the culture to looking inside, be mindful, and exercise our consciousness about what is it that we are building on ourselves emotionally.
Well, and that's why I feel that when we're discussing this idea of the emotional body, it's not a tangible thing for many people. That there is a reaction we have, and we actually give it a name, and maybe it's compassion or anger, excitement or fear. And sometimes it requires us to sit back and ask some of those hard questions. This is the feeling I have in my body. This is my physical body reacting. What is my emotional response? Where do I go with that? And as you said, it's something that can get wounded. It's something which is different. And I was talking with someone recently where an emotional problem rarely gets solved by an intellectual solution. That when we're working through something that happened emotionally to us, so many times I know that I've felt that I've stuffed those emotions down. And for me, that's whenever those things build and fester and cause more problems, cause more self-sabotage, cause more strife between me and someone else. So
You mean trying to restrain the emotion?
to contain them or to push them aside to not feel them. So because each time that they get deflected or blocked or stuffed or pushed away, once again, if that is like the lights on your dashboard telling you that something is off and you don't listen to them, the signals get louder. It starts screaming. That then becomes more the noise because something is wrong. And when the message doesn't come through respectfully, that voice in our heads actually becomes really disrespectful to catch our attention about something is off between our actions, our words, and where we want to be, where our soul is actually taking us, what our purpose is, what that core identity of who we are. And so it takes a fair amount of work. Shadow work can be considered emotional work. I know that we've actually mentioned that a little bit in the past as well. And I know that Charlie Morley's work talks a lot about those judgments of ourselves, good or bad, tend to be what is turned into this shadow material, this part of us that we're looking to disown. And to me, that's the ignoring of what's happening in our emotional body.
There is a poem, Michael. I believe I mentioned this on the podcast before a long time ago, but there is a poem. It's called The Guest House from Rumi. I don't know if that's the name of the author. It's in other results that I'm getting here, but it's called The Guest House. It's Rumi, the name of the author. Yeah. And it talks about this being human thing is being a house of guests. And the guests, they come and they knock on the door. And if we allow them to get in, they'll do whatever they have to do, and they get out. They don't tend to stay long. But when we keep the visitors outside, they keep bashing, like you say, bashing and stronger. They demand to get in. They demand your attention, and they demand that you recognize them so they can do whatever they have to do and get out. And this is how emotions are. They come. If we ignore and we put them to the side, they'll be louder and louder, like you say, and be like, hey, I really need some of your attention. And that's our emotional body. It's some response, chemical, or I don't know, probably chemical, that is happening there. And if we neglect it, it's a sign of something. It's being triggered. And if we neglect that, it's continue to be triggered. And that chemical in our body might not be so good, might be unbalanced. Our system might get unbalanced because we are not giving attention to things that are triggering us in some detrimental way. Yeah, because the emotions that we wish to ignore usually are scary. They might be something that we don't wish to deal with. It usually leads to the side of the things you mentioned, self-sabotage. Yeah.
I know that Louise Hay talks quite a bit about the emotions, the thoughts, the ruminating thoughts that tend to lead to then physical distress. So if you are always anxious, your body does release hormones into your body, that cortisol and adrenaline, that then, yes, is great in the moment whenever we need that burst of energy, but not so good on the rest of our organs, because the nutrients that they need are actually for rest and digestion. So we can very much have this physical representation over a period of time if we don't actually experience, work through, and let go of those emotions.
And about these chemicals that are released, when you were speaking, I recognize something. If they are being released in our body, because let's say cortisol, things like that, for us to run or something like it, a burst of energy that we feel. And in an anxiety attack, for example, the person will feel this burst of energy. They will not understand all those emotions that are coming, and they are not releasing it. Like they're not putting them out. So they might have an anxiety attack because there's all this energy for you to run and be desperate for your life, and you're still there sitting.
So that's one of those that's one of those situations where potentially a physical movement can disarm an emotional problem. Can. is when, as if it is this kind of chemical response where all of a sudden we fall into that fight or flight mode. And some people lash out instead when they're in this anxiety space, and some of them turn that all inward instead. So I know that I have a tendency to pull back whenever I'm actually feeling anxious. So I don't tend to express that until things get overwhelming, and then I become really angry and upset and explodes instead. So that's how that kind of plays out for me. So I've had to find a physical movement to help express some of that upset and anger. And the ideal thing is that not to be another person, that it's not going to be damage to your surroundings or damage to yourself, is finding a way to express that in a way that is healing through it. As an example, I was on a men's team for 2 years, almost 3. And that was a space that was considered for us safe to bring what you're up against, if that is emotional or intellectual or physical or spiritual. There's an opportunity to express that so you can heal through it. But like we were talking about earlier, is that the stereotype tends to be that men shouldn't be emotional. But guess what? Men are emotional. Men do experience emotions. But I feel that in many cultures that we are taught, that we're actually shown, and we are rewarded for suppressing emotions. And in doing so, I think that's actually caused more harm than good in the long run. So not being able to express love for someone or upset without it turning into anger and violence, because we're not practiced with it as a skill. So each person, I feel it's been really helpful for me to have an outlet to be able to express emotions. And for a while there, that was therapy. For a while there, that was energy work. For a while there, it's, talking through things with my loved ones. And sometimes it required a men's team, so that I had a place where that was considered safe to share. Because I think is why so many men that I've experienced don't express their emotions, because it wasn't safe for them to do. Because I've seen men who are, it's almost scary whenever we tap into that deep well of emotion that we have, especially if it's from anger or fear or grief or sorrow or sadness, or at those extremes. And having a place to express it, I think, is really necessary for everyone, for that to be a place that is okay to do.
And by the way, Michael, you spoke about healing the emotional body. And I do believe that a great way for us to heal our emotional body, particularly momentaneously, is breathing. When we take a deep breath, we might recover a bit of that balance that was lost before on the hormonal system, on the emotional body. Of course, that deeper wounds, things that are engraved deeper and that have a big emotional charge to them, they might take more than a few deep breaths to overcome. And we do recommend for people that have past trauma and things like that to seek a therapy, counseling. I don't know.
So I would say that some professional who's skilled in that work is necessary. It's possible for some people to heal that on their own, but I would say that it's less often that it's done alone than with someone else who can guide you. If it is a hypnotherapist, if it's a spiritual leader, if it's a psychotherapist, if it is someone who is really skilled at navigating that. Because some of the toughest parts, whenever I've dumped on a friend, as an example, where I'm at emotionally, I can get stuck there. I can get stuck at the bottom. So that's where a therapist or another professional can actually help. Yes, go into the depths of that emotion, but actually then recover on the way out, because that's part of their training, is don't leave somebody more broken than whenever you found them. It's the ideal. And that may not be the right words, but certainly not stuck in the rut. So
don't break them.
yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes when we don't have the proper knowledge and we try with the best of intentions to help a friend, there are some problems that will drag others with them, and you might break yourself trying to help someone. Human beings are infectious, and remember how unconscious we are. So, indeed, if there is some trauma, it's good to seek a professional. And if we see somebody, if we know somebody that is experiencing some serious trauma, it's good to recommend them, if we have the intimacy, to go see a professional, because it's not our role to help people recover from emotional wounds. We need to understand that. It's important. And and this doesn't change the fact that the work that we do with Life Vision, we have seen Danny and Jesse spoke about his journey through therapy, and he was doing Lifebook, and he was doing some therapy. He was seeing a therapist somehow. I don't remember the details, because those are different works. And Lifebook and coaching, I believe mostly coaching, is more related to performance, to improving results, setting goals, creating a vision, and actually getting there. It's more related to productivity.
And I know that there are several coaches out there who actually title themselves as a coach who are also therapists. And I would say that they are uniquely qualified to actually do both. And
That's
it's a matter
true.
of finding the right person, the right set of skills that are going to allow you to get through that. And once again, I just want to reiterate is, if you have that level of intimacy with someone, to say, hey, go get help, rather than just someone on the street, I would say, be careful of that, but actually love someone enough to say, hey, I care about you and I see that you're struggling. How can we help? Would us getting you connected with a therapist be the right work? Or is there someone else that we can actually get involved to help you through this, help you heal this? Because like I said earlier, is many times an emotional wound doesn't get healed through an intellectual process or even a physical process. It requires an emotional process. And there are shamans, there are healers, there are spiritual leaders who are skilled in that side of things as well. So find what works for you. And
Mhm.
because I think that if we were less triggered, that things like what's happening in the world right now would happen far less often. And
Mhm.
understanding kind of the positive side, the growth side of understanding our emotions, rather than using them as leverage on other people to force them to act in a way that's against their character, that's against who they believe that they are, in order for you to get to your own ends. So we've talked around this quite a bit, but the a lot of where our emotions do get triggered, I know at least for me, is whenever I've applied a meaning to an action or a set of words that someone has actually used, because we are meaning making machines. And as Bruno said earlier, if a person who is like this did this action, then the emotional wound can happen because all people like that do this action. And that is, to me, is very polarizing. It's very simplistic, and as close to the truth as it may be in many cases, I don't think that anything in this world, there's 100% thing. I don't think anything in the world is 100% of anything. It's never 100% meaning this versus that. Me being the optimist, I tend to come from this place of, you're doing this because you feel like it is going to protect someone or help you move forward in some way, shape, or form, because I want to see the best in people. That's my approach. But I've had interaction with people where they're looking for that which is negative about people. So you have something to talk about. So you have something to gossip about. So you have leverage on someone else. And for me, I'm just that deeply curious person. I want to understand how someone got where they are, understand how they think, how they've processed what they've been through. But there's an opportunity to untangle some of this by noticing when emotions come up. What patterns are you seeing in this? Because we are meaning making machines, which means we've actually think that we've seen a pattern and then we have applied a definition to the pattern. That's the meanings we're talking about. Is if every time it rains, I get achy in my bones, then I then attribute then that I must have a disease that responds to the weather. Is that accurate, or am I trying to connect things that may not be related? They might be, but I've then applied a meaning to that. If every single time somebody says bubble gum, that means that I'm going to get hit because that's what would happen when I was a kid. That's a meaning that I've applied to that. So we have this opportunity in therapy, in coaching, in the spiritual work that we're doing to repattern some of that stuff where it's appropriate, where it's actually necessary because it's holding us back. So I think that it is some of the deeper work that we're talking about that is unraveling some of this, so we can actually pull it apart, clean the parts, and put it back together. Because I know, at least for me, is that I don't want to feel like someone else can control my actions by pushing my buttons, by triggering me. And in order for me to do that, I've got to go find the buttons, and then I've got to pull the wires out from underneath. I need to figure out what is the trigger for that. Maybe follow it back to where the button is so that emotion doesn't get triggered. And yes, that's a logical process that I look at is, how do I delve into that emotion and experience it?
It's something that I remember when you were speaking, because we spoke a lot about today. We spoke a lot today about triggers, and there was a time, Michael, not long ago, before the pandemics. It was something that really dawned on me before the pandemics, shortly before. People would talk about triggers, and I would be curious about it, but I would have it's like a prejudice, this preconception of like people being triggered, like a fragility or something like that. Oh, people that are triggered, they are fragile some way. And I would perceive somehow like that. And I'd be like, such a silly thing. But then I started to notice a pattern. It was with dating, talking with women. I was very curious and trying to understand and learn. And then I better understood this thing about the trigger. And I started to taking it very seriously. And I started to understand that not only women are triggered, because the women, they talk about more like this. I don't know there in the US, but here in Brazil, trigger is usually a word that women use, and they are usually talking about men. It triggers something on me. And that's the contact that I first have with this word. I didn't remember using it before. And then I started to understand that's real. That thing that we spoke about, identifying, classifying people, we see the patterns, and those patterns that we are talking about, that they exist and everything, we manifest them. And the challenge is that most people, they are not aware of this concept. And even when they are aware, it's so hard to actually visualize our patterns for what they are. Like the example of bubblegum that you mentioned, let's imagine this scenario. This really happened. Every time an event happened on break, and a kid got some stigma, and people hit them, they pass by them and they hit him in the head, say, hey, bubblegum, poof, hit him in the head, something like that. And then the adult, faces a college kid, school kid, and the kids, hey, bubblegum. And that person might not even recognize that they are feeling it, but they might feel a discomfort. They might feel a retraction. Perhaps they even feel an emotional pain. And they just think, I don't really like this guy. Something like that. And we do not recognize that is part of the system that was built, a pattern. And it's very challenging, I believe, Michael, to recognize those patterns and go, as you said, behind the dashboard and tinker with things and diffuse the button. That's a very deep work that requires a lot of mindfulness to be achieved.
I agree. It does require a lot of mindfulness, patience, compassion, forgiveness, and many times some help. to actually be able to, unravel that. If it is through a meditative practice, through a prayer practice, if it is tapping or havening or any number of different tools to actually get our other bodies out of the way so we can then work on the healing of that emotional body. That's kind of part of what I think that tools like EFT or havening is intended for, is to let's distract the physical and the mental body over here, and then we can work on the emotional stuff while that's out of the way. And then, okay, let's put this back. Everything's fine. Everything's good. As we then reorganize the connections that we've made, so we can actually see. And not always do we need to understand exactly where that wire goes either. Sometimes we can just snip that. That's a fair amount of what hypnotherapy is about, is let's actually figure out where that wire goes. Okay, let's go into a place we don't want to go. Let's snip it right there so that we don't actually get triggered by that again.
And this talk about dashboards, and we even spoke when we were preparing about lights, emotions being like lights in a dashboard that give us signals. And then we spoke about, but what is the button then? If the emotions are the lights, what are the buttons? But here's the things. There is this movie, I don't remember exactly what's the name of the movie, but it's a Pixar movie, I believe, Michael.
Inside Out.
Inside Out. And it's such a good analogy. It's clearly it's so fantastic, but it's such a cool analogy because that is so true. We have those emotions, those basic emotions, and they are triggering us all the time and receiving signals, interpreting signals, and it's like, oh, this is dangerous. Let's fear, something like that.
And as we're hoping to encourage people to live a more intentional life, it's then to be aware of what your emotions are when they're coming up. Being aware of maybe roll back the tape by half an hour and seeing what the experience was. What was the recipe that actually caused that emotion to come up? And sometimes maybe actually going and looking at the footage from the past, like what you were talking about in Inside Out, of let's pull out that memory and say, oh, when I was 6, when I was 11, I decided to do that because of this. I'm now 45. Do I want a 6-year-old determining how I'm going to react to bubblegum? Is that really the person I want to put in charge of that? So it's an opportunity for us to then, when we see that pattern come up often enough, when we determine that's not how we want to be experiencing life, then let's intentionally choose the recipes that are going to get us to where we want to be. Surround ourselves with the people who are going to be challenging us, yes, but supporting us along the way as well. Have those. If you feel like crap every single time you light up a cigarette, let's look at what caused you to want to light up the cigarette in the first place. If you actually do you think that you feel better by actually overeating or by eating at all hours of the day? Let's figure out a way to determine what is triggering that emotional response, and then unravel it, pull it apart, heal that in us if it's something that we don't want anymore. It's weeding the garden. It's actually pulling out those things that we don't want here anymore because they don't serve us. Not that we're broken, not that we are flawed, but the way I react to that is not what I want anymore.
And another interesting thing from the Danny and Jensi interview was when Jensi say that he dreamed. Jensi has a health problem, he has a challenge, and he lost great part of his movements, from what I understood, and he's working on recovering them. And he's seeing progress. And he says something like, I dreamed I was fully functional, and that was very challenging because when I woke up, I didn't have those functions that I had in the dream. And then he expressed it. He said to himself, I don't want to dream with this anymore. And he even says that he doesn't know if it was helpful to his recovery or not, but emotionally it was much better for him not to have to deal with that. So he decided that with himself. And he said that he never had a dream where he was fully functional again. And there is this power. What Michael was talking about is the power of us to resignify our emotions, our experiences. How do we feel? What is the meaning that we are giving to this past experience that we had that might be not so good? And we also have the power to take out things and throw them away. This doesn't serve me anymore. I don't want to be using this connection anymore. And we can make that decision. It is an emotional decision because when Gen Z decided not to dream fully functionally anymore, like when he visualized himself in dreams fully functional anymore, that had a deep emotion attached to it. So again, emotions, they give strength to the decisions and to the meanings that we give to our experiences.
There's also this premise that I have in my life book. So in the structure, a premise is a core belief, a foundational belief that all others are built on. And for me, it's actually, I took this from Jim Quick, is that a experience plus an emotion equals a long-term memory. I'll play that again. An experience plus an emotion equals a long-term memory. And it's actually a multiplication of that. It's not just plus. So if you have a small emotional response to an experience, you are less likely to remember it. If you have a strong emotional response to something, you are more likely to remember it. So that can be fear in the extreme. It can also be love in the extreme. It can be excitement. So keeping that in mind of why, coming back to our original question, is why are we talking about emotions? Why are they important? If we know that the memories that we're going to be able to serve up more easily is based on there being an emotion attached to it, a strong one at that, what memories do we want to keep? Do we want to keep the memories of pain and suffering? Or do we want to keep the memories of joy and happiness? So in doing so, well, how do we get there? Many times it's actually choosing the recipe that's going to get you the emotions you want, yes. And that's going to be by doing the actions that you enjoy doing with the people that you enjoy doing it. But it's also going to be, this is something that I talk about a little bit in preparing for the climb, is it's my belief that happiness doesn't come from an action. Happiness is something that you bring to an action. Let me play that back again. Happiness is not something that you get by doing it. It's something that you bring to it. And you'll find that your experience is going to be completely different. If you go in and you decide to go out for a jog and you're hating every step versus I'm going to enjoy this, I'm happy to go out and go for a jog. It'll be a very different experience. So this has been an awesome conversation, Bruno. I think that this is one of those ones where this is a conversation I think we need to be having, and having with the right people and in the right space, so we actually learn how to do this as a skill to navigate, to express, and to heal our emotional bodies.
Thank you, Michael. I also love this conversation. It's very good. And it's very important for us to be talking about those things that culturally are not so very well discussed and presenting. Ideas that are not usually discussed. I like this. And that are important and necessary for us as human beings and as beings in society. Yeah.
Well, thank you again for spending some time with us. We will be doing another podcast this month where we're talking about emotions, because like I said, March is the time frame that in the Lifebook cadence we actually do a deep dive in this. So next week we're going to be talking about overwhelm, if my memory serves me. I look forward to having that conversation with you. And until then, my name is Michael Danklefs of Elevate Your Best.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great day.